Hello guys, in today's video I will be answering exactly how many shares of Apple that you need in order to retire in 2030. I will be going over 3 different scenarios, a bear scenario, an average scenario and a bull scenario. In order to figure out the exact amount of shares needed in order to retire, well then it is super important that we first figure out how much money is actually necessary in order to retire in 2030. In order to figure out how much money we actually need, well then I have used this article here, which has found that the average American person spends $5,111 per month. However, this number is very likely to change due to inflation. So when I adjust this number for inflation at an inflation rate of 4% until 2030, well then I get a monthly spending of roughly $6,700 per month. So that means that the average spending in 2030 adjusted for inflation should be somewhere around $6,700 per month. However, we also need some money for personal spending each month. So therefore I have set the monthly withdrawal here to $8,000 per month or $96,000 per year from our investment in 2030 and beyond. The total cost for 25 years in retirement is $2,880,000. However, due to compound interest and the true power of investing, well then this is actually not the number that you need to have invested by 2030. And that is because your investment will of course continue to provide you a return every single year within those 30 years that you spend in retirement. The next thing that we need to figure out is the growth rate of our investment after we have retired. And I've set this growth rate to be 9%. The reason is that the S&P 500 index, when adjusted for inflation, has roughly provided investors with a return of 8.5% per year. But Apple has historically more or less always been above that return, so therefore I've set the return of Apple to be slightly higher at 9%. And I don't find that too unrealistic when it comes to a company like Apple. In order to figure out the exact amount of money that I need to have invested in 2030 in order to retire, then I am using this simple retirement calculator here. And when I put in our monthly expenses here and the growth rate of our investment, well then I basically found that we need to have $1 million invested into Apple in 2030 in order to spend 30 years in retirement. Here you can basically see how the balance of our investment is changing over time, and by the time it reaches 30 years, well then it's basically gone. Now that we know how much money we need to have invested in Apple by 2030, we can start working our way backwards in order to figure out how many shares of Apple we would actually need. And this is where the fun and the interesting part begins. What you see here is basically 3 different scenarios: a bear case, an average case and a bull case. And these are used for determining the true value of Apple in 2030, with the difference being the growth rate of the investment. So depending on which scenario that you think is the most likely for Apple over the next 30 years, well then that is going to determine how many shares of Apple that you actually need in order to retire. But let's start with the bear case and work our way up. At the top of the screen you basically see the investment target for 2030, and that is the 1 million that I just found before. And you see the current market cap for Apple, which is roughly $2.45 trillion. So let's start with the bear case here. Here I basically assume that Apple is growing at a growth rate of 7%, which is just slightly below the S&P 500 index. With a growth rate of 7%, well then will Apple have a market capitalization of nearly $4 trillion in 2030, and that equals a share price of $262 per share. The calculation for the price per share is basically found by dividing the market cap for Apple with the amount of outstanding shares that they have. And the amount of outstanding shares is calculated here. Today Apple has 16 billion outstanding shares. And here I also assume that there is a growth rate in the amount of outstanding shares of roughly 2%, which again is around the average number. That means that if the amount of shares is growing by 2%, well then in 2030 Apple will have 18 billion outstanding shares. That means that you, in order to have $1 million invested in Apple by 2030, you would have to invest roughly $597,000 today. But don't worry about this number being high. Please do remember that this is the bear case, and when you're looking at the average case and the bull case, well then you're gonna see this number decrease significantly. In the average case, well then I basically assume a growth rate of roughly 9%. This number is taken from Yahoo Finance, where some analysts have made their predictions on Apple's future growth rate. According to the analyst, well then Apple is going to have a growth rate that is roughly 0.5% higher than the S&P 500 indexes. And I find this to be very reliable given the amount of innovation that Apple has. At a growth rate of 9%, well then we basically get a market cap of Apple in 2030 of $4.4 trillion. and that gives us a price per share of $299. At this growth rate, well, then you would actually need 3,349 shares in order to retire in 2030. And if you were to buy all of these shares today, well, then it would basically cost you $525,000. In the last scenario, the bull scenario, I've set the growth rate to be 12%, and I actually think that this number could have been a lot higher considering that this is Apple we're talking about. But given that Apple is already the biggest company in the world measured by market capitalization, well, then it is somehow very unlikely that they're going to continue seeing these absurd high growing rates. However, given the amount of innovation that Apple has, well, then I definitely don't think it will be impossible for a company like Apple to get higher growth rate than 12%. However, I've set it to be 12%, which I think is a bit conservative, but that's the number I have decided to go with. So at a 12% growth rate, well, then we basically get a market cap for Apple in 2030 of $5.4 trillion. And that basically gives us a price per share for Apple of $361. This means that in this scenario, well, then you would basically only need 2,669 shares of Apple in order to retire in 2030. For the price of $450,000, well, then you can basically spend the next 30 years of your life in retirement, assuming that Apple grows at a rate of 12% per year. So in order to sum all of this up, well, then you basically need somewhere between $434,000 and $597,000 in order to retire in 2030 and then spend 30 years of your life in retirement. It does of course depend on which scenario that you find to be most likely for Apple in the future. But please do remember that all of these calculations and all of these numbers, well, they are basically based on you having the same monthly expenses as the average American person does. It is worth mentioning that this is only a thought experiment where I basically calculate how many shares of Apple you would need in order to retire in 2030, depending on what growth rate it is. And therefore it is not 100% reliable, since I very unfortunately cannot predict the future movements of Apple. So just keep that in mind. With all of that being said, well then, thank you for watching today's video. If you actually liked the video, then press the like button below and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos like this one in the future. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.